Welcome to Woo English. In this story, you'll learn English through clear and simple sentences. We encourage you to share your thoughts and leave comments. If you enjoy the story, please press the like button. It really helps support us. This story is for educational purposes. Our goal is to help you improve your English while enjoying an inspiring tale about Plato. His life offers valuable lessons about wisdom, leadership, and the power of ideas. But we do not encourage or glorify any actions in the story. Let's begin the journey together. Chapter 1. The Beginning of a Great Mind. Once upon a time, in the ancient city of Athens, a boy was born. His name was Plato. Athens was a beautiful city, full of life, art, and ideas. The streets were busy with people talking, debating, and sharing stories. It was a city where great thinkers gathered. And Plato was destined to become one of the greatest. Plato was born into a noble family. His father, Ariston, was a respected man, and his mother, Perictione, came from a family with a long history in Athens. They had high hopes for their son. Plato's family was wealthy, which meant he could receive the best education available. And education in Athens was something special. From a young age, Plato was curious about the world around him. He asked many questions. Why is the sky blue? What is the meaning of life? How should we treat each other? These were not ordinary questions for a child, but Plato was no ordinary child. He was always thinking, always wondering. In Athens, education was a big part of life. Young boys like Plato went to school to learn many things. They studied reading, writing, poetry, music, and gymnastics. But the most important subject for Plato was philosophy. Philosophy means the love of wisdom. And Plato loved wisdom more than anything else. Plato's teachers noticed his intelligence. They saw that he was different from the other boys. He was serious, thoughtful, and always eager to learn. He read the works of Homer, the great poet, and learned about the heroes of Greek mythology. He listened to the stories of the gods and goddesses, Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and he imagined what it would be like to meet them. But while other boys were interested in becoming soldiers or politicians, Plato wanted to understand deeper things. He wanted to know the truth about the world. He wanted to understand what was right and what was wrong. He wanted to know why people did the things they did. Athens was the perfect place for a young thinker like Plato. The city was full of philosophers, men who spent their days talking about ideas, asking questions, and seeking answers. These philosophers would meet in the agora, the marketplace, to debate and discuss. It was a lively place, where ideas were exchanged like goods at a market stall. Plato loved to listen to these debates. He would stand quietly at the edge of the crowd, his eyes wide with wonder, his ears open to every word. The philosophers talked about justice, love, beauty, and truth. They asked questions that had no easy answers. Questions that made people think. One of the most famous philosophers in Athens was a man named Socrates. Socrates was known for his method of questioning. He believed that by asking the right questions, you could find the truth. He didn't just give answers. He made people think for themselves. And this fascinated young Plato. Plato began to follow Socrates around the city. He listened to him in the marketplace, in the streets, and in the homes of wealthy Athenians. Socrates would ask questions like, "What is justice?" or "What is the good life?" These questions seemed simple, but they were actually very complex. They made people think deeply about their lives and their choices. Plato was amazed by Socrates. He saw how Socrates could take an ordinary conversation and turn it into a deep discussion about the most important things in life. Plato wanted to be like Socrates, wise, thoughtful, and full of questions. But life in Athens was not just about thinking and talking. It was also a time of great change and conflict. The city was at war with Sparta, another powerful Greek city-state. The war was long and difficult, and it caused much suffering in Athens. The people were tired, and their spirits were low. Despite the war, Athens remained a place of culture and learning. The city was home to great artists, playwrights, and thinkers. Plato grew up surrounded by this rich culture. He watched plays by the famous playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides. He admired the sculptures and paintings that decorated the city. And he listened to the music that filled the air during festivals. As Plato grew older, he began to develop his own ideas about the world. He started to think about what he wanted to do with his life. He knew he wanted to be more than just a thinker. He wanted to make a difference. He wanted to help people understand the truth, just like Socrates did. But life had its own plans for Plato. He was about to face challenges that would test his beliefs and shape his future. The city of Athens was changing, and so was Plato. Plato's journey was just beginning. He was still a young man, full of dreams and questions. He didn't know it yet, but he would go on to become one of the greatest philosophers in history. His ideas would change the world and influence people for thousands of years. As we follow Plato on his journey, we will see how he grows from a curious boy into a wise man. We will learn about his life, his struggles, and his philosophy. We will discover how he came to believe in the power of ideas and how those ideas can change the world. So let us continue with Plato as he takes his first steps on the path to greatness. Chapter 2: The Wise Teacher. In the bustling city of Athens, where the air was thick with ideas and debates, there lived a man named Socrates. Socrates was not like the other men in Athens. He didn't wear fancy clothes, and he didn't give long speeches to impress people. No. Socrates was different. He was a man who asked questions, deep, challenging questions, questions that made people stop and think. One day, Plato heard about this strange man. People said Socrates was the wisest man in Athens. They said he could make you question everything you thought you knew. Plato was curious, very curious, so he decided to find out more about this wise teacher. Plato went to the agora, the marketplace where Socrates liked to talk to people. It was a busy place, full of merchants selling their goods and people discussing politics, news, and gossip. But Plato wasn't interested in buying or selling. He was there to meet Socrates, the man everyone was talking about. When Plato first saw Socrates, he was surprised. Socrates didn't look like a wise man. He was older, with a round face, a thick beard, and eyes that seemed to look deep into your soul. But there was something about him, something that drew people in. Socrates wasn't just talking. He was teaching. Socrates was surrounded by a group of young men, all listening carefully to his words. He wasn't giving them answers. No, he was asking them questions. "What is justice?" he asked one young man. The young man thought for a moment and then gave his answer. But Socrates wasn't satisfied. "Why do you think that is justice?" he asked again. And so the young man had to think more deeply. Plato was fascinated. He had never seen anything like this before. Socrates didn't tell people what to think. He made them think for themselves. Plato watched as Socrates asked question after question, each one deeper than the last. It was like peeling an onion, layer after layer, until you got to the core of the truth. Finally, Socrates noticed Plato standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. He smiled and motioned for Plato to come closer. "You, young man, what do you think?" Socrates asked. Plato was nervous. What could he say to such a wise man? But he gathered his courage and answered. And so began the most important relationship of Plato's life. Socrates became Plato's teacher, his mentor, his guide. Every day, Plato would follow Socrates through the streets of Athens, listening to him ask questions, watching him debate with others. Socrates taught Plato to question everything, to never accept anything without first thinking deeply about it. Socrates had a special way of teaching. He believed that true wisdom came from knowing that you know nothing. This might sound strange, but to Socrates, it made perfect sense. He believed that only by admitting our ignorance could we begin to learn. And so, he taught Plato to always be humble, to always seek the truth, no matter how difficult it might be. Plato was a good student. He listened carefully to everything Socrates said. But more than that, he started to ask his own questions. He began to see the world in a new way. Everything was a mystery to be explored, a puzzle to be solved. Plato's mind was like a sponge, soaking up all the wisdom that Socrates had to offer. But Socrates didn't just teach Plato about philosophy. He also taught him about life. Socrates believed that a good life was one where you lived according to your principles. He believed in justice, in truth, and in doing what was right, even when it was hard. He taught Plato that it wasn't enough to know what was right. You had to live it. As Plato spent more time with Socrates, their bond grew stronger. They weren't just teacher and student. They became friends. They would walk together through the city, talking about everything under the sun. Sometimes they would sit by the river, watching the water flow and discuss the nature of the universe. Other times, they would stand in the marketplace, debating with anyone who would listen. Socrates had a way of making everything seem important. Every question, every idea, every conversation. Plato loved this about him. It made him feel like there was always something new to learn, always something more to understand. But not everyone in Athens liked Socrates. Some people thought he was dangerous. They didn't like the way he made people question everything, especially the powerful leaders of the city. They thought Socrates was corrupting the young men of Athens, filling their heads with strange ideas. Plato didn't care what others thought. He knew that Socrates was teaching him something valuable, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He admired Socrates' courage, his commitment to the truth, and his willingness to stand up for what he believed in, even when it was unpopular. Plato knew that he had found a true teacher, a wise teacher, And in the years to come, everything Plato learned from Socrates would shape his own ideas, his own philosophy. The questions that Socrates asked, the way he looked at the world, these would become the foundation of Plato's own thinking. But for now, Plato was happy just to learn, to listen, to ask questions. The journey of a philosopher was not an easy one, but with Socrates by his side, Plato knew he was on the right path. And so, Plato's journey continued, under the watchful eye of the wisest man in Athens, his teacher, his guide, Socrates. Chapter 3. The Trial of Socrates. The city of Athens, a place once full of hope, ideas, and freedom, began to change. The atmosphere grew tense. People whispered in the streets, rumors spread, and fear crept into the hearts of many. Something dark was happening. And in the center of it all was Socrates, the man who had taught so many to think for themselves, to question everything, to seek the truth. Socrates, Plato's beloved teacher, was in danger. It all started with accusations. Some powerful men in Athens began to say that Socrates was a troublemaker. They claimed that he was corrupting the youth, filling their minds with dangerous ideas. They said that he was disrespecting the gods and leading people away from the traditional ways of the city. These men were afraid of Socrates, afraid of his questions, afraid of his influence. Plato couldn't believe what was happening. How could anyone accuse Socrates of wrongdoing? Socrates was the wisest, most just person Plato had ever known. He had dedicated his life to seeking the truth and teaching others to do the same. But now, he was being treated like a criminal. The day of the trial arrived. The air was thick with tension as people gathered in the courtroom. The room was crowded, filled with curious citizens, angry accusers, and a panel of judges. Plato was there too, sitting quietly among the spectators, his heart heavy with worry. He knew this trial was more than just a legal case. It was a battle for the very soul of Athens. Socrates stood calmly before the judges. He did not shout. He did not plead. He was as calm as ever, even in the face of such serious accusations. The prosecutors spoke first. They painted Socrates as a dangerous man, someone who was leading the youth of Athens astray. They accused him of disrespecting the gods, of questioning everything that the city held dear. Plato listened in disbelief. The words of the prosecutors were harsh, filled with anger and fear. But Plato knew they were wrong. Socrates wasn't leading people astray. He was helping them see the truth. But the crowd was restless. Some were nodding in agreement with the prosecutors. Others were whispering to each other, unsure of what to think. Then it was Socrates' turn to speak. He didn't try to defend himself in the way the judges might have expected. He didn't beg for mercy or apologize for his actions. Instead, he did what he always did. He asked questions. Socrates asked the judges and the people of Athens to think about what justice really meant. He questioned whether the accusations against him were based on truth or on fear. He reminded them that he had spent his life seeking wisdom, not causing harm. And then he asked the most important question of all. Is it better to follow what is right or to follow what is popular? The room fell silent. The power of Socrates' words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Plato watched as the judges listened, some with furrowed brows, others with averted eyes. Could they see the truth in Socrates' words? Could they understand that he was not their enemy, but their teacher? But the fear in Athens was too strong. The judges were afraid of losing control, afraid of what might happen if they let Socrates continue to spread his ideas. And so, despite his wise and powerful words, they found Socrates guilty. Plato's heart sank. The verdict was like a heavy stone, crushing all hope. The judges sentenced Socrates to death by drinking poison. It was a harsh punishment, a punishment for a crime that Plato knew his teacher had never committed. The days that followed were filled with sorrow. Plato visited Socrates in his prison cell. It was a small, dark room, but Socrates' spirit was as bright as ever. He was not afraid of death. He welcomed it as just another step in the journey toward truth. Plato marveled at his teacher's strength, his courage, his unwavering commitment to his principles. Socrates spent his last days talking with his friends and students, continuing to ask questions, continuing to teach. Even in his final moments, he remained true to himself. He showed Plato, and everyone else, that living a just life was more important than living a long life. He showed them that the pursuit of truth was worth any sacrifice, even death. And then, the final moment came. Socrates was given a cup of hemlock, a deadly poison. Plato watched in silence, his heart heavy with grief, as Socrates calmly took the cup. He raised it to his lips and drank. There was no fear in his eyes, only peace. He lay down on his bed, surrounded by his friends and students, and waited for the poison to take its effect. As the poison spread through his body, Socrates continued to speak, his voice growing weaker with each word. He talked about the soul, about the afterlife, about the things that truly mattered. And then, with one final breath, Socrates was gone. Plato was devastated. The loss of his teacher was almost too much to bear, but in the midst of his sorrow, he found a new resolve. He knew that Socrates' death was not the end. His ideas, his questions, his wisdom, they would live on. And Plato would make sure of it. Socrates' trial and death changed Plato forever. It opened his eyes to the flaws in the world around him, the injustice, the fear, the ignorance. But it also strengthened his commitment to philosophy. He knew that he had to continue the work that Socrates had started. He had to keep asking questions, keep seeking the truth, no matter the cost. The trial of Socrates was a tragedy, but it was also a turning point. It marked the end of one great life and the beginning of another. Plato would go on to become one of the greatest philosophers in history, carrying with him the lessons he had learned from his wise teacher. Chapter 4. A New Path. The sun set over Athens, casting long shadows across the city. But in Plato's heart, there was a deeper darkness. The death of Socrates had shaken him to his core. His teacher, his mentor, his friend, was gone. The man who had taught him to think, to question, to seek the truth, was no longer there to guide him. Plato was heartbroken, but within that heartbreak, a new resolve began to form. Plato knew he couldn't stay in Athens, not now. The city that had once been a place of learning and freedom now felt suffocating. The trial of Socrates had shown Plato the dangers of ignorance and fear, how powerful men could use those forces to silence the truth. Plato needed time to think, to reflect, to find his own path, and so he made a decision. He would leave Athens and travel. The world beyond Athens was vast and full of wonders. Plato wanted to see it all, to learn from new places, new people, new experiences. He packed his belongings, said goodbye to his family, and set off on a journey that would change his life. First, Plato traveled to Megara, a city not far from Athens. Megara was known for its philosophers, thinkers who, like Plato, had been influenced by Socrates. In Megara, Plato met Euclid, not the mathematician, but a philosopher who had studied with Socrates as well. They talked for hours, sharing memories of their teacher, discussing philosophy, and thinking about the future. In Megara, Plato found comfort, but he knew his journey was just beginning. Next, Plato traveled to Egypt, a land of ancient wisdom. The pyramids stood tall against the sky, silent and mysterious. The Nile River flowed gently, giving life to the land around it. In Egypt, Plato learned about the gods and myths of the Egyptians, stories that were different from those of Greece, but just as rich and full of meaning. He studied with the priests, who taught him about mathematics, astronomy, and the mysteries of the universe. Egypt was a place of deep learning, and it left a lasting impression on Plato's mind. But Plato didn't stop there. His journey took him even further, to the land of Cyrene. There, he met Theodorus, a famous mathematician. They talked about numbers, shapes, and the laws that govern the universe. Plato had always been fascinated by the idea that the world was made up of patterns, that everything had a form, a structure. His conversations with Theodorus helped him see how mathematics could explain the world, how it could be a bridge between the physical and the abstract. From Cyrene, Plato continued to travel, visiting many other places in the Greek world. He went to Italy, where he met the followers of Pythagoras, another great thinker. The Pythagoreans believed that numbers were the key to understanding the universe, that everything, even music and the stars, could be explained through mathematics. Plato was inspired by their ideas, and he began to think more deeply about the nature of reality. As Plato traveled, he met many wise people. He listened to their stories, learned from their teachings, and shared his own ideas. Each place he visited, each person he met, added something new to his understanding of the world. Plato's mind was like a garden, and with each new experience, it grew richer, fuller, more complex. But as much as Plato loved to travel, there was something calling him back to Athens. He knew that his journey had given him many new ideas, but now it was time to do something with them. It was time to take everything he had learned and create something new, something that could help others, just as Socrates had helped him. So, after many years of traveling, Plato returned to Athens. The city was still the same in many ways, the same streets, the same buildings, the same people. But to Plato, it felt different. He was no longer the young student who had followed Socrates around the city. He was older now, wiser, with new ideas, new dreams. Plato decided that he needed to create a place where people could learn, where they could ask questions, seek the truth, and grow as thinkers. He wanted to honor Socrates' legacy and share what he had learned on his travels. And so, Plato founded the Academy. The Academy was unlike any other school in Athens. It wasn't just a place to learn facts or memorize lessons. It was a place for discussion, for debate, for the exploration of ideas. Plato invited people from all over to come and learn. His students weren't just young men from noble families. They were anyone who wanted to seek the truth, to understand the world, to become better thinkers. At the Academy, Plato taught his students about philosophy, mathematics, science, and ethics. He shared with them the ideas he had developed on his travels, his belief in the world of forms, the idea that everything in the physical world was just a shadow of a perfect, eternal form. He taught them about justice, about the soul, about the importance of living a virtuous life. Plato also encouraged his students to ask questions, just as Socrates had done. He didn't want them to simply accept what he said. He wanted them to think for themselves, to challenge ideas, to seek their own understanding. The Academy became a place where minds were sharpened, where ideas were born, where the seeds of future philosophies were planted. And so, Plato found his new path. It was a path that honored his past, but also looked forward to the future. The Academy became his life's work, a place where he could share the wisdom he had gained and where his ideas could live on, even after he was gone. Plato's journey had taken him far from Athens, but it had also brought him back to the city he loved, back to the place where his teacher had lived and died. In his travels, Plato had found himself, and in the Academy, he had found a way to keep the spirit of Socrates alive. As the years went by, the Academy grew, and so did Plato's reputation as a philosopher. His students went on to become great thinkers, leaders, and teachers themselves. The ideas that Plato developed on his journey, the lessons he learned from Socrates, continued to influence the world for centuries to come. Plato's new path was not just a path for himself. It was a path for all who sought wisdom, who loved learning, who believed in the power of ideas. It was a path that would lead to new discoveries, new philosophies, new ways of understanding the world. Chapter 4. A New Path. After the tragic death of Socrates, Plato was heartbroken. The man who had taught him so much, who had inspired him to seek the truth, was gone. Athens, once a city of vibrant ideas and lively debates, now felt cold and empty to Plato. He could not stay, not after what had happened. So, with a heavy heart, Plato made a decision. He would leave Athens. Plato needed time to think, to heal, and to find his own way. He decided to travel, to explore the world beyond Athens, to learn from new places and new people. He believed that by seeing more of the world, he could discover new truths and find a new path for himself. First, Plato traveled to Megara, a city not far from Athens. Megara was home to a group of philosophers who, like Plato, had been close to Socrates. In Megara, Plato found comfort among these thinkers. They shared stories of Socrates, remembered his teachings, and together they mourned the loss of their great teacher. In Megara, Plato began to realize that the ideas Socrates had taught them would live on, even if Socrates himself was gone. But Plato knew that he could not stay in Megara forever. He needed to see more, to learn more. So he continued his journey, traveling further from Athens, further into the unknown. Plato's travels took him to Egypt, a land of ancient wisdom and mystery. The sight of the towering pyramids and the mighty Nile River amazed him. Egypt was a place where knowledge was cherished, where the past and the present seemed to blend together. Plato studied with the Egyptian priests, who taught him about their gods, their philosophy, and their understanding of the universe. He learned about mathematics, astronomy, and the mysteries of the stars. Egypt opened Plato's mind to new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing the world. After Egypt, Plato traveled to Cyrene, a city in North Africa. There, he met Theodorus, a renowned mathematician. Theodorus introduced Plato to the world of numbers and shapes, showing him how mathematics could explain so much about the world around them. Plato was fascinated by the idea that behind the physical world, there were deeper truths, patterns, forms, and structures that governed everything. These ideas began to shape Plato's own thinking, giving him new tools to understand the world. But Plato's journey did not end there. He continued to travel, visiting places like Italy, where he met the followers of Pythagoras, another great thinker. The Pythagoreans believed that numbers were the key to understanding the universe, and their ideas influenced Plato deeply. He began to see the world not just as a place of physical objects, but as a place where deeper, eternal truths existed. Truths that could be understood through reason and thought. As Plato traveled from city to city, he met many wise people. He listened to their teachings, debated their ideas, and shared his own thoughts. Each new place, each new person added something to Plato's understanding of the world. His mind was like a sponge, soaking up knowledge wherever he went. The more he learned, the more he realized how much there was still to discover. But as much as Plato enjoyed his travels, he began to feel a pull, a desire to return home. Athens was where his journey had started, and he knew that it was where he needed to go next. But he would not return to Athens as the same man who had left. The experiences of his travels had changed him, shaped him, and he was ready to take on a new role in the city he loved. When Plato returned to Athens, he found a city still recovering from the loss of Socrates. But rather than dwell on the past, Plato looked to the future. He wanted to create something new, something that would honor Socrates' legacy and continue his work. He wanted to create a place where people could come to learn, to think, to question, just as he had done with Socrates. And so, Plato founded the Academy. The Academy was not like the other schools in Athens. It was a place for deep thinking, for exploring the mysteries of life, for seeking the truth. Plato invited anyone who was eager to learn, young men, older men, anyone who had a love for wisdom. The Academy became a place where ideas were exchanged, where students could discuss philosophy, mathematics, science, and ethics. But most importantly, it was a place where students could learn to think for themselves, to ask questions, to seek their own understanding. At the Academy, Plato shared the ideas he had developed during his travels. He taught his students about the world of forms, the belief that behind every physical object was a perfect, eternal form that existed in a higher realm. He discussed justice, the soul, and the importance of living a virtuous life. But Plato didn't just lecture his students. He encouraged them to debate, to question, to explore their own ideas. He wanted them to be active participants in their own learning, to carry on the tradition of questioning that Socrates had started. Plato's academy quickly became famous throughout Greece. People from all over came to learn from Plato and his students. The academy became a center of knowledge, a place where the next generation of thinkers and leaders were trained. Plato's dream of continuing Socrates' work had become a reality. Math was not just about teaching, it was about learning. Even as he taught his students, Plato continued to seek new knowledge, to explore new ideas. He wrote down his thoughts, creating works that would be read and studied for centuries to come. In his writings, Plato explored the big questions. What is justice? What is truth? What is the good life? He used dialogues, conversations between characters to explore these ideas, just as he had once done with Socrates. Through his travels, Plato had discovered that the world was full of knowledge, full of different ways of thinking, different ways of seeing the world. But he had also learned that the search for truth was a journey that never really ended. There was always more to learn, more to discover, more to understand. And that, for Plato, was the most important lesson of all. As Plato looked back on his journey, from the heartbreak of losing Socrates to the joy of founding the academy, he realized that every step had led him to where he was now. His travels had shown him new worlds, new ideas, new possibilities, and they had helped him find a new path, a path that he would walk for the rest of his life. Plato's journey was far from over, but now he had a purpose, a mission. He would continue to seek the truth, to teach others, to explore the mysteries of life, and in doing so, he would keep the spirit of Socrates alive, not just in Athens, but in the minds and hearts of all who sought wisdom. Chapter 5. The Academy. Plato returned to Athens, but this time he was different. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was a philosopher with a grand idea. After years of traveling, learning, and thinking, Plato had a vision that would change the world. Plato had decided to start a school, but not just any school. He wanted to create a place where people could come together, to think, to debate, to learn, to seek the truth. He wanted a place where ideas could flourish, where minds could be sharpened, where the next generation of leaders could be born. And so, the academy was born. The academy wasn't like the schools we know today. It wasn't a big building with classrooms and desks. No, the academy was much more than that. It was a gathering place, a community of thinkers. Plato found a peaceful spot outside the city, near a sacred grove dedicated to the hero Academus. This place was perfect, quiet, surrounded by nature, yet close enough to Athens so that people could easily come and go. Plato invited everyone who was interested in learning. Young men, old men, anyone with a thirst for knowledge. They came from all over Greece, eager to learn from the great philosopher, Plato. The students at the academy didn't just sit and listen. They engaged in lively discussions. They asked questions, debated ideas, and explored the mysteries of life. At the academy, Plato didn't teach in the traditional way. He didn't stand in front of his students and lecture them. Instead, he used a method he had learned from his beloved teacher, Socrates. Plato asked questions, lots of questions. He believed that by asking the right questions, his students could discover the answers for themselves. This method was called the dialectic, and it became the heart of the academy. Plato's students would often walk with him through the grove, talking about philosophy, mathematics, politics, and science. They would sit under the trees, by the river, or in the shade of the ancient olive trees, and they would discuss the big questions. What is justice? What is the good life? What is the nature of reality? These discussions were intense, but they were also exciting. Each conversation was like a journey, taking the students deeper into the world of ideas. The academy quickly became famous throughout Athens and beyond. People from all over the Greek world came to study with Plato. They were drawn to his wisdom, his method of teaching, and the vibrant community he had created. The academy was a place where everyone could learn, where everyone could grow. One of the most important ideas that Plato taught at the academy was the theory of forms. Plato believed that everything in the physical world was just a shadow of something more perfect, something more real. He believed that there was a higher realm of existence where these perfect forms existed. For example, every chair in the world is just an imperfect copy of the perfect form of a chair, which exists in this higher realm. This idea fascinated Plato's students, and it became one of the central teachings of the academy. But the academy wasn't just about philosophy. Plato believed that a well-rounded education was important. His students studied mathematics, astronomy, and music. They learned about the natural world, the stars, and the universe. Plato believed that by understanding the world around them, his students could better understand the deeper truths that lay beyond it. Plato also believed in the importance of ethics, of living a good and just life. He taught his students that it wasn't enough to simply know what was right, they had to live it. The academy was not just a place of learning, it was a place of moral development. Plato wanted his students to become not just wise men, but good men, who would use their knowledge to help others. The academy became a place where the future leaders of Athens and beyond were made. Plato's students went on to become philosophers, politicians, and rulers. They carried with them the lessons they had learned at the academy, the importance of seeking the truth, of asking questions, of living a just and virtuous life. One of Plato's most famous students was Aristotle. Aristotle came to the academy as a young man, eager to learn from Plato. He studied at the academy for 20 years, and he would go on to become one of the greatest philosophers in history. Aristotle's ideas were different from Plato's, but the time he spent at the academy shaped his thinking and influenced his work. Plato's influence didn't stop with his students. The academy itself became a model for future schools and universities. The idea that education should be about more than just memorizing facts, that it should be about thinking deeply, asking questions, and seeking the truth. This idea became the foundation of Western education. But the academy wasn't just a place for learning. It was a place for friendship, for community, for the exchange of ideas. Plato created a space where people could come together, support each other, and grow together. The relationships that were formed at the academy were just as important as the knowledge that was gained. Plato's academy continued for centuries after his death. It became a symbol of the pursuit of wisdom, of the love of learning, of the search for truth. The ideas that were born in that quiet grove outside Athens went on to shape the world, to inspire future generations of thinkers, scientists, and leaders. As Plato grew older, he looked back on his life and the work he had done with pride. The academy was his legacy, a living testament to his belief in the power of ideas. Plato had taken the lessons he had learned from Socrates, the lessons he had gathered on his travels, and he had created something that would last far beyond his own lifetime. The academy was more than just a school. It was a dream, a vision of what education could be. It was a place where minds could meet, where ideas could be shared, where the future could be shaped. And in creating the academy, Plato had found his new path, a path that would lead not just him, but all who followed toward wisdom, toward truth, and toward a better world. Chapter 6. The World of Ideas. In the quiet, peaceful grove of the academy, surrounded by students eager to learn, Plato shared his most famous idea. It was an idea that would change the way people thought about the world forever. This idea was called the theory of forms. Imagine a world, not the world we see around us every day, but a world that exists beyond it, a world of perfect forms, perfect ideas. Plato believed that everything in our world, the trees, the animals, the people, even the objects we use, was just an imperfect copy of something more perfect, more real in this higher world. He explained it like this. Think about a chair. You've seen many chairs in your life. Some are made of wood, some of metal, some are big, some are small. But despite their differences, they are all chairs. Why? Plato believed that it's because they all share in the same perfect idea of a chair, the form of a chair. This perfect form doesn't exist in our world. It exists in the world of ideas, a place that can only be understood with the mind, not the senses. Plato told his students, what we see with our eyes, touch with our hands, are just shadows of the true reality. The real truth lies beyond, in the world of ideas. This idea fascinated his students. They had never thought about the world in this way before. They began to see the world around them as just a reflection of something greater, something perfect that they could only imagine. But the theory of forms didn't just apply to objects like chairs or tables. Plato believed it applied to everything: beauty, justice, goodness, love. He taught that these concepts, too, had perfect forms. For example, in our world, we see many things that are beautiful, but these are just imperfect copies of the perfect form of beauty, which exists in the world of ideas. The same is true for justice. We may see acts of justice in our world, but true justice exists only in its perfect form. One of Plato's students asked, "But how can we know these perfect forms if we can't see them?" Plato smiled and replied, "We can know them through our minds, through reason and thought, the mind can reach beyond the physical world and touch the eternal truths that lie in the world of ideas. To help his students understand this better, Plato told them a story that has become one of the most famous in all of philosophy. It's called The Allegory of the Cave. Imagine, Plato began, a group of people who have lived all their lives in a dark cave. They are chained in such a way that they can only see the wall in front of them. Behind them, there is a fire, and between the fire and the people, there are objects being moved around. These objects cast shadows on the wall, and the people see these shadows. For them, the shadows are the only reality, because that's all they've ever known. Now imagine one of these people is freed from the chains. He turns around and sees the fire and the objects, and he realizes that the shadows on the wall were not the real things, just reflections. If he leaves the cave and steps out into the sunlight, he sees the world as it truly is, bright, colorful, full of life. At first, the light hurts his eyes. It's so bright that he can't see anything. But gradually, his eyes adjust, and he begins to see the world in its full reality. He understands now that the shadows in the cave were just illusions. But what happens, Plato asked, if this person goes back into the cave and tries to tell the others what he has seen? They wouldn't believe him. They might even think he's crazy. They've only ever known the shadows, and they can't imagine that anything else could be real. Plato looked around at his students, their eyes wide with wonder, as they imagined the dark cave, the shadows, and the bright light of the sun. He continued, "The cave is like our world, and the shadows are like the things we see around us. The sun represents the truth, the world of ideas. The journey out of the cave is the journey of the mind, as it moves from the darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge and understanding." Plato's students were deeply moved by this story. They began to see their own learning as a journey out of the cave toward the light of truth. They understood that the world around them was just a starting point, and that true wisdom lay beyond in the world of ideas. But Plato's theory of forms wasn't just a way of thinking about objects or concepts. It was also a guide for how to live a good life. Plato believed that if people could understand the perfect forms, like justice, goodness, and beauty, they could live better, more virtuous lives. He taught his students that the goal of life was to align themselves with these perfect forms, to strive to bring these ideals into their own lives and into the world around them. Plato believed that the leaders of society should be philosophers, people who had made the journey out of the cave and understood the world of ideas. He called these leaders philosopher kings. According to Plato, only those who truly understood the forms could govern justly and wisely, because they would know the true nature of justice, goodness, and truth. Plato's ideas were revolutionary. They changed the way his students thought about the world and about themselves. The theory of forms became the heart of Plato's philosophy, the foundation on which he built his teachings. His students were inspired by these ideas, and they carried them forward, spreading them throughout the Greek world and beyond. As the years passed, the Academy became known as a place where the deepest questions of life were explored, where the mind was trained to reach beyond the physical world and touch the eternal truths. Plato's theory of forms continued to influence philosophers, scientists, and thinkers for centuries to come. In the quiet moments when Plato reflected on his life and his work, he knew that the world of ideas was more than just a theory. It was a vision of a world that could be, a world of perfection, of truth, of beauty. And through his teachings, he helped others see that world too, not just with their eyes, but with their minds. Plato's journey didn't end with the theory of forms. It was just the beginning. His ideas would continue to evolve, to inspire, to challenge. And in the minds of his students, and in the hearts of all who sought wisdom, the world of ideas would live on, a beacon of light in the darkness, a guide on the journey toward truth. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Plato here on Woo English. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and comment. Your feedback means a lot to us and helps us bring you more inspiring content. Chapter 7. The Republic. In the heart of Athens, in the peaceful grove of the Academy, Plato had a dream. This was no ordinary dream, but a vision of a perfect society, a place where justice ruled, where wisdom guided, and where people lived in harmony. Plato imagined this ideal world and put his thoughts into writing. The result was one of the most famous works in the history of philosophy, the Republic. The Republic wasn't just a book. It was Plato's vision for how the world could be. It was a conversation, a dialogue between characters, exploring the big questions of life. What is justice? Who should rule? How should people live together in society? These were the questions that Plato sought to answer. Plato began with the idea of justice. He believed that justice wasn't just about laws or punishment. It was about everyone doing what they were best suited to do. In his ideal society, everyone had a role, a place where they could contribute to the common good. Whether they were farmers, soldiers, or rulers, each person would play their part in creating a just and harmonious society. But who should lead this society? Plato had a radical idea. He believed that the rulers should be philosophers. Yes, philosophers. People who loved wisdom, who sought the truth, who could see beyond their own desires and interests. Plato called these rulers philosopher kings. He believed that only those who truly understood justice, goodness, and truth could govern wisely and fairly. Plato's idea of the philosopher king was revolutionary. In his time, rulers were often chosen because of their wealth, their power, or their birth. But Plato argued that these things didn't make someone a good leader. What mattered most was wisdom, the ability to see what was right and to act on it. A philosopher king wouldn't rule for personal gain, but for the good of all. They would be selfless, just, and wise, leading the people toward a better, more just society. In the Republic, Plato also talked about education. He believed that education was the key to creating a just society. From a young age, children would be taught to love wisdom, to seek the truth, to understand justice. They would learn about philosophy, mathematics, music, and gymnastics. Plato believed that education should develop both the mind and the body, creating well-rounded individuals who could contribute to society. But Plato's vision didn't stop there. He imagined a society where people lived together in harmony, where there was no need for excessive wealth or power. In his ideal society, everyone shared what they had and worked together for the common good. There would be no rich or poor, no powerful or weak, only citizens working together for a just and happy life. Plato also introduced the idea of the three classes in society. He believed that people were naturally suited to different roles based on their abilities and virtues. The first class was the rulers, the philosopher kings, who would govern with wisdom and justice. The second class was the soldiers, who would protect the society and uphold the laws. The third class was the producers, the farmers, artisans, and workers who would provide for the material needs of the community. Each class had its own role, and when each did its job well, the whole society would function smoothly, like a well-oiled machine. This balance, this harmony, was what Plato believed to be the essence of justice. When everyone did what they were best suited to do and worked together for the common good, society would be just and fair. But Plato also recognized that this ideal society was difficult to achieve. Human nature is complex, and people often act out of selfishness, greed, or ignorance. That's why education was so important in Plato's vision. He believed that by educating people, by teaching them to love wisdom and to seek justice, we could create a society that was closer to his ideal. As Plato shared his ideas in the Republic, his students were fascinated. They discussed these ideas passionately, debating what justice really meant and what it would take to create such a society. Some of them dreamed of one day seeing Plato's vision become a reality, a world where philosopher kings ruled, where justice prevailed, and where people lived in peace and harmony. But Plato knew that his ideal society was just that, an ideal. It was a model, a vision of what could be, not necessarily what was. He understood that the real world was full of challenges, conflicts, and imperfections. Yet, he believed that by striving toward this ideal, by working to make our own societies more just, more wise, more harmonious, we could create a better world. Plato's Republic was not just a book of ideas. It was a call to action. It was a challenge to the people of his time and to all future generations to think deeply about justice, to question who should lead, and to consider how education could shape a better society. It was an invitation to imagine a world where wisdom guided our decisions, where justice was not just a word, but a way of life. As Plato continued to teach at the academy, the Republic became one of the central texts for his students. They studied it carefully, discussed it passionately, and carried its ideas with them as they went out into the world. Plato's vision of the ideal society may not have been realized in his time, but his ideas lived on, inspiring countless others to think about justice, leadership, and education in new and profound ways. In the quiet moments when Plato reflected on his work, he knew that the Republic was more than just a book. It was his legacy, a blueprint for a better world, a world where wisdom and justice reigned. And though he knew that this perfect society might never be fully achieved, he believed that the journey toward it, the effort to make the world a better, more just place, was what truly mattered. Plato's Republic continued to influence thinkers, leaders, and philosophers for centuries to come. Its ideas spread far beyond the walls of the academy, shaping the way people thought about government, society, and justice. And through it all, Plato's vision of a world led by philosopher kings, a world where wisdom and justice guided every decision, remained a powerful ideal, a shining light in the quest for a better world. Chapter 8. Shadows in the Cave. In the peaceful grove of the academy, where students gathered eagerly to learn, Plato shared a story that would become one of the most famous in all of philosophy. This story was not just a tale, but a powerful lesson about life, about what we see, what we believe, and what is truly real. It was the story of the cave. Plato began, his voice calm, yet full of mystery. Imagine, he said, a group of people who have lived their entire lives in a dark cave. They are chained in such a way that they cannot move their heads. They can only see the wall in front of them. They have been in this cave since birth, knowing nothing of the world outside. The students leaned in closer, their eyes wide with curiosity. Behind these people, Plato continued, there is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a walkway where others pass by, carrying objects, statues, animals, and other things. These objects cast shadows on the wall in front of the prisoners. Because they have never seen anything else, these shadows are all they know. To them, the shadows are reality. Plato paused, letting the image sink in. The students could almost see the dark cave, the flickering shadows, the prisoners trapped in their chains. It was a haunting picture, a world of darkness and illusion. But now, Plato said, imagine that one of these prisoners is freed. At first he would be confused, frightened even. He turns around and sees the fire, the objects casting the shadows. He realizes that what he thought was real was just an illusion. The shadows were not reality. They were just reflections of something more real. The students nodded, beginning to grasp the meaning of the story. But Plato wasn't finished. Then, he said, his voice rising with excitement, this freed prisoner is taken out of the cave, into the light of the sun. At first, the bright light would blind him. It would be painful, and he would want to return to the safety of the shadows. But as his eyes adjust, he begins to see the world as it truly is. He sees colors, shapes, the sun itself. He understands now that the cave was a place of shadows, and that the real world is full of light and truth. Plato looked at his students, their faces reflecting deep thought. The story was simple, but its meaning was profound. This, Plato explained, is the journey of the mind, from ignorance to knowledge, from darkness to light. Most people live their lives in the cave, believing that the shadows they see are the whole truth. They do not question. They do not seek. But the philosopher, the lover of wisdom, is like the prisoner who is freed. He turns away from the shadows and seeks the light, the truth. The students began to understand. The cave was a metaphor for life, for the way most people live, unaware of the deeper truths that lie beyond what they can see. The shadows represented the illusions, the false beliefs, the incomplete understanding of the world. And the light outside the cave, that was the truth, the knowledge that only a few would ever seek. But what happens, Plato asked, if the freed prisoner returns to the cave? What if he tries to tell the others what he has seen? They have lived their whole lives in the darkness. They know nothing but the shadows. They might think he is crazy. They might not believe him. They might even reject him. The students were silent, thinking about the challenge of bringing knowledge to those who were still trapped in ignorance. Plato's story was not just about the search for truth. It was also about the difficulty of sharing that truth with others. The cave, Plato continued, is our world. The shadows are the things we see and believe without question. The journey out of the cave is the philosopher's journey, the search for truth, for wisdom, for understanding. It is not an easy journey. It is painful, difficult, and often lonely. But it is the journey that leads to the light, to reality, to the truth. Plato's students were deeply moved by the story. They saw themselves in the freed prisoner, striving to break free from the chains of ignorance to see the world as it truly was. They also saw the responsibility that came with knowledge, the duty to help others see the truth, even when it was difficult. Plato's allegory of the cave became a central teaching at the academy. It was more than just a story. It was a guide to life, a reminder that what we see is not always what is real, that we must always seek to look beyond the surface, to question, to explore, to find the deeper truths that lie hidden in the shadows. As the students discussed the story, they began to see the world around them in a new light. They questioned their own beliefs, their own perceptions, wondering how much of what they knew was just shadows on a wall. They realized that the search for truth was not just about learning facts or gaining knowledge. It was about changing the way they saw the world, the way they understood reality. Plato's story of the cave also had a deeper meaning for him personally. He knew that his own journey, his search for wisdom, his teaching at the academy, was like the journey out of the cave. He had turned away from the shadows, from the illusions of the world, and sought the light of truth. But he also knew the challenges of bringing others with him, the difficulty of helping people see beyond the shadows, to embrace the truth. As the sun set over the academy and the day came to an end, Plato looked at his students, knowing that they were beginning their own journeys, their own search for truth. The story of the cave was a starting point, a way to understand the challenges they would face, the importance of questioning, of seeking, of never being satisfied with the shadows on the wall. And so, Plato's allegory of the cave became more than just a story. It became a symbol of the philosophical journey, a reminder that the search for truth is a journey from darkness to light, from illusion to reality. It was a story that would echo through the ages, inspiring countless others to break free from the chains of ignorance and seek the light of knowledge. In the quiet of the night, as the students reflected on the story, they knew that their lives would never be the same. They had seen the shadows, but now they were ready to seek the light. Chapter 9. The Critique of Democracy. In the bustling city of Athens, the birthplace of democracy, voices rose in heated debate. Athens was proud of its democratic system, where every citizen had a voice, a vote, a say in how the city was governed. But amidst this chorus of voices, there was one that began to question, to criticize, to warn. That voice belonged to Plato. Plato had seen the power of democracy firsthand. He had watched as the people of Athens made decisions together, as they elected leaders, passed laws, and judged the fate of their city. But he had also seen the dark side of this freedom, the chaos, the manipulation, the way that smooth talkers and ambitious men could sway the masses. And, most painfully, he had seen how democracy had led to the trial and death of his beloved teacher, Socrates. Plato's experiences made him deeply skeptical of democracy. He believed that not everyone was fit to rule, that not every opinion was equal, that too much freedom without guidance could lead to disaster. In his writings and teachings, Plato began to criticize democracy. He argued that when everyone had the power to make decisions, the city was at risk of being led by the unwise, the uninformed, the selfish. He worried that democracy allowed people to choose leaders based on popularity, not wisdom, on charm, not character. To Plato, this was a dangerous path, one that could lead Athens into chaos and ruin. Plato believed that true leadership required wisdom, a deep understanding of justice, of the good, of what was best for the city as a whole. But in a democracy, he argued, it was too easy for power to fall into the hands of those who lacked this wisdom, those who cared more about their own interests than the well-being of the city. To illustrate his point, Plato used an analogy, a simple yet powerful story. He asked his students to imagine a ship, a large vessel sailing the open sea. The ship needed a captain, someone who knew the stars, the winds, the currents, someone who could navigate the dangers of the ocean and lead the ship safely to its destination. Now imagine, Plato said, that on this ship, the crew decides to vote on who should be the captain, but instead of choosing the person who knows how to sail, they choose the person who gives the best speeches, or promises the most rewards. What will happen to the ship? It will surely be lost, tossed about by the waves, with no one to guide it. Plato's students listened carefully, understanding the message behind the story. The ship was like the city, and the captain was like its leader. Without wisdom, without knowledge, the city would be in danger, just like the ship without a skilled captain. Plato's criticism of democracy was controversial. Athens was proud of its system, and many believed that it was the best way to govern, that it gave everyone a fair chance, that it ensured freedom and equality. But Plato argued that this freedom could be dangerous, that when everyone's voice was equal, it was too easy for the loudest voices, not the wisest, to take control. He believed that instead of democracy, the city should be led by philosopher kings, wise rulers who understood the true nature of justice and the good. These philosopher kings would not seek power for themselves, but would govern for the benefit of all. They would be trained from a young age, educated in philosophy, ethics, and the sciences, to ensure that they had the wisdom needed to lead. Plato's ideas sparked debates across Athens. Some people agreed with him. They too had seen the flaws in democracy, the way that clever politicians could manipulate the masses. They admired Plato's vision of philosopher kings, of a city ruled by wisdom and justice. But others were angry. They saw Plato's ideas as a threat to their freedom, to the very foundations of their city. They believed that democracy, with all its flaws, was still the best way to ensure that everyone had a voice, that everyone could participate in the decisions that affected their lives. The debates grew heated, the discussions intense. Plato's criticism of democracy touched a nerve in Athens, a city that was proud of its traditions, but also struggling with the challenges of leadership, of governance, of maintaining order in a rapidly changing world. Plato knew that his ideas were controversial, that they challenged the very core of Athenian identity. But he believed deeply in what he was saying. He had seen the dangers of democracy up close, and he could not stay silent. He wanted to provoke thought, to encourage people to question the status quo, to consider what true leadership really meant. Despite the controversy, Plato's ideas began to influence some of the brightest minds in Athens. His students at the academy were inspired by his vision. They debated his ideas, challenged his arguments, and carried his teachings into the wider world. Some of them went on to become leaders themselves, guided by the principles they had learned from Plato. But Plato also knew that his vision of philosopher kings was difficult to achieve. Human nature was complex, and power was tempting. Even the wisest rulers could fall prey to corruption, to the desire for control, to the pressures of the world around them. Plato understood that his ideal society was just that, an ideal. It was a goal to strive for, not necessarily something that could be fully realized in the real world. And yet, he believed that the pursuit of this ideal was important. Even if the perfect society could never be achieved, the effort to reach it could make the world a better place. Plato wanted his students, and all who heard his ideas, to think deeply about what kind of society they wanted to live in, what kind of leaders they wanted to follow, what kind of world they wanted to create. As the sun set over Athens and the city grew quiet, Plato continued to write, to teach, to share his ideas. He knew that his critique of democracy was just one part of his larger philosophy, a philosophy that sought to understand the nature of justice, of truth, of the good. He wanted to inspire others to seek wisdom, to question, to think, to not just accept the world as it was, but to imagine what it could be. Plato's critique of democracy was challenging. It was uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. It forced people to think about the dangers of unchecked freedom, the importance of wisdom in leadership, and the role of education in shaping a just society. And though his ideas were controversial, they left a lasting impact on Athens and on the world. And so, Plato's journey continued, his ideas sparking debates, inspiring change, and challenging the way people thought about democracy, leadership, and the very nature of society. Chapter 10. The Philosopher King. In the quiet halls of the academy, where the brightest minds of Athens gathered, Plato spoke of a dream. This dream was not of riches or power, but of a ruler, a leader who was wise, just, and knew the truth. Plato called this leader the philosopher king. Plato believed that a true leader, a true king, must love wisdom above all else. Not just any wisdom, but the kind that sees beyond the surface, that understands the deeper truths of life. A philosopher king would be someone who knew what was truly good, who could see the difference between what seemed right and what was right. This ruler would not be swayed by personal gain or the temptations of power. No. A philosopher king would rule for the benefit of all, guided by justice and truth. Plato's idea of the philosopher king was born from his experiences, from watching how easily leaders could be corrupted, how often the wrong people ended up in power. He had seen how democracy, with all its freedom, could sometimes lead to chaos, to the rise of leaders who cared more about winning the people's favor than doing what was right. And so, he dreamed of a different kind of leader, one who was not chosen because of wealth or popularity, but because of wisdom. But could such a ruler ever exist? Could a person with the qualities of a philosopher king really be found? Plato thought deeply about this question. He knew that finding someone who was wise, just, and selfless was not easy. Most people, even those with good intentions, were influenced by their desires, their fears, their ambitions. Power had a way of changing people, of tempting them to put their own needs above the needs of others. Plato understood this, but he also believed that the pursuit of the ideal was important. In the Republic, Plato described how a philosopher king might be trained. From a young age, this person would be educated not just in the practical skills of leadership, but in philosophy, in the love of wisdom. They would be taught to understand the forms, the perfect, eternal truths that lay beyond the physical world. They would learn about justice, beauty, and goodness, not just as abstract concepts, but as guiding principles for life. This education would be long and challenging. It would test the character of the future ruler, ensuring that only those who were truly committed to the good of society would rise to the top. The philosopher king would need to be someone who had made the journey out of the cave, who had seen the light of truth and was no longer content with the shadows of the world. But Plato knew that this ideal was difficult to achieve. Even with the best education, the best training, there was no guarantee that a philosopher king would emerge. Human nature was complex, full of contradictions and weaknesses. And yet, Plato believed that the effort to create such a leader was worth it, that even striving for this ideal could bring about a better society. As Plato shared his vision with his students, many were inspired. They could see the appeal of a ruler who was wise, just, and selfless, a leader who would guide the city with fairness and truth. They dreamed of a world where philosopher kings ruled, where wisdom and justice were the foundations of society. For these students, Plato's vision was not just a dream, but a goal to strive for, a model for how leaders should be. But not everyone was convinced. Some questioned whether such a ruler could really exist. They pointed out that even the wisest philosophers were still human, still capable of making mistakes, of being tempted by power. They wondered if it was realistic to expect that one person could possess all the qualities of a philosopher king. Others worried about the dangers of concentrating too much power in the hands of one person, even a wise one. What if the philosopher king, despite their education and good intentions, made the wrong decisions? What if they became corrupted by the very power they were given? These critics argued that it was safer to have a government where power was shared, where many voices could be heard, rather than relying on the wisdom of a single ruler. Plato listened to these concerns, and he understood them. He knew that his vision of the philosopher king was an ideal, not a guarantee. But he also believed that the pursuit of this ideal could lead to a better society, that by striving to create wise and just leaders, we could avoid many of the problems that came from unwise and unjust ones. Plato's idea of the philosopher king was more than just a political theory. It was a reflection of his deepest beliefs about the nature of leadership, of justice, of truth. He believed that the best rulers were those who ruled not for themselves, but for the good of all, who sought wisdom not for their own benefit, but to guide others. In a world full of uncertainty and change, Plato's vision was a beacon of hope, a reminder that true leadership is about more than power, more than popularity. It is about wisdom and justice. As the students at the academy discussed these ideas, they found themselves thinking deeply about what kind of leaders they wanted to be, what kind of society they wanted to create. They debated the merits of democracy, of kingship, of philosopher kings, each bringing their own experiences and insights to the conversation. Plato encouraged these debates, knowing that through them his students were developing their own understanding of leadership, of justice, of the good. Plato's vision of the philosopher king may have been an ideal, but it was an ideal that inspired countless others. It challenged people to think about what true leadership meant, to question the easy answers, the simple solutions. It reminded them that the pursuit of wisdom, of justice, of truth, was the highest calling, one that required dedication, humility, and a deep love for the good of all. As the sun set over Athens and the day came to an end, Plato knew that his work was far from over. The idea of the philosopher king was just one part of his larger philosophy, a philosophy that sought to understand the nature of the good, the just, the true. But in this idea, Plato saw a glimpse of what could be a vision of a world where wisdom and justice reigned, where leaders were guided by truth, not by self-interest. And so, Plato's journey continued. His vision of the philosopher king inspiring those who sought to lead with wisdom, to govern with justice, to create a world where the good of all was the highest priority. In the hearts and minds of his students, and in the pages of the Republic, the idea of the philosopher king lived on, a dream of what leadership could be, of what society could become, if only we had the wisdom to make it so. Chapter 11. The Last Days. Plato was growing old. His hair had turned white and his steps had slowed. But his mind was as sharp as ever. Even as his body began to weaken, Plato's thoughts remained clear, powerful, and full of wisdom. He continued to teach, to write, and to think, always searching for the truth. In the peaceful grove of the academy, surrounded by his loyal students, Plato reflected on his long life. He had seen so much, experienced so much. He had lived through the highs and lows of Athens, had watched his beloved city change over the years. He had been a student of Socrates, a traveler, a teacher, and a philosopher. And now, as he approached the end of his journey, he looked back on it all with a deep sense of fulfillment. Plato still loved to engage in discussions with his students. They would gather around him, eager to hear his thoughts on justice, beauty, truth, and the nature of reality. Plato's eyes would light up as he spoke, his voice still strong and passionate, even as his body aged. He would ask questions, challenge ideas, and guide his students on their own paths to wisdom. One of Plato's favorite topics in these final years was the soul. He believed deeply in the immortality of the soul, the idea that it lived on even after the body died. Plato taught that the soul was connected to the world of ideas, the realm of perfect forms. He explained that our souls longed to return to this higher world, to reconnect with the true, the good, and the beautiful. Plato's students were fascinated by these teachings. They listened intently as he described the journey of the soul, from the physical world, through the trials of life, and back to the world of ideas. Plato told them that living a just and virtuous life was the best way to prepare the soul for this journey. By seeking wisdom and truth, by acting with justice and goodness, they could help their souls find their way back to the divine. As Plato grew older, he also spent more time writing. He wanted to leave behind a legacy, a record of his thoughts, his teachings, his philosophy. He knew that he would not live forever, but his ideas could live on. And so, Plato wrote with a sense of urgency, capturing his thoughts on paper, sharing his wisdom with the world. His writings were filled with dialogues, conversations between characters who explored the deepest questions of life. These dialogues were not just about answers. They were about the process of thinking, questioning, and discovering. Plato believed that true wisdom came not from knowing all the answers, but from always seeking the truth. In his last days, Plato often thought of Socrates, his teacher, his mentor, his friend. He remembered the conversations they had shared, the questions they had asked, the ideas they had explored together. Socrates had been a guiding light in Plato's life, and his influence could be seen in everything Plato did. Even now, years after Socrates' death, Plato felt his presence, guiding him, inspiring him, pushing him to continue seeking the truth. Plato also reflected on his beloved Athens. The city had changed so much since his youth. It had faced wars, political upheaval, and social change. But through it all, Athens had remained a place of learning, of culture, of ideas. Plato loved his city. Despite its flaws, despite its mistakes, he believed that Athens had the potential to be a place of great wisdom, a place where justice and truth could flourish. But Plato also knew that Athens was not perfect. He had seen the dangers of democracy, the rise of demagogues, the execution of Socrates. He had criticized the city's leaders, challenged its values, and offered his own vision of a better society. Plato's love for Athens was deep, but it was also critical. He wanted the city to live up to its potential, to be the best it could be. In these final days, Plato found peace in the knowledge that he had done his part, that he had contributed to the ongoing conversation about justice, truth, and the good life. He knew that his ideas would continue to be debated, discussed, and explored by future generations. His work was not finished, but he trusted that others would carry it forward. As he looked around the academy, at the faces of his students, Plato felt a deep sense of satisfaction. These young men and women would continue the search for wisdom, would continue to ask the big questions, would continue to explore the mysteries of life. Plato had planted the seeds of thought, and now he watched as they grew into a rich, vibrant field of ideas. Even as his body grew weaker, Plato's ideas grew stronger. They spread beyond the walls of the academy, beyond the city of Athens, beyond the borders of Greece. His writings were copied and shared, his teachings discussed in distant lands. Philosophers, leaders, and scholars from all over the world came to study Plato's works, to learn from his wisdom, to engage with his ideas. Plato's influence was profound. His ideas shaped the course of Western philosophy, influenced the development of science, and inspired countless thinkers throughout history. The Academy, which he had founded so many years ago, became a model for future schools and universities. The dialogues he had written were studied for centuries, becoming some of the most important texts in the history of philosophy. But for Plato, it was not about fame or recognition. It was about the pursuit of truth, the love of wisdom, the desire to understand the world and our place in it. Plato had dedicated his life to this pursuit, and in his final days, he felt at peace, knowing that he had lived a life of purpose and meaning. As the sun set over Athens and the day came to a close, Plato knew that his journey was nearing its end, but he also knew that the journey of his ideas was just beginning. His thoughts, his teachings, his philosophy, they would live on, carried forward by those who sought wisdom, who questioned the world around them, who longed to understand the deeper truths of life. Plato's last days were filled with reflection, with teaching, with writing, but most of all, with a sense of fulfillment. He had lived a long and meaningful life, had shared his wisdom with the world, had inspired others to seek the truth. And, as he looked back on it all, Plato knew that his ideas would continue to grow, to spread, to influence the world for generations to come. And so, Plato's journey came to an end. But his legacy lived on. His ideas, his philosophy, his love of wisdom, these would continue to shape the world, to guide those who sought the truth, to inspire those who longed to understand the mysteries of life. In the hearts and minds of his students, in the pages of his writings, in the legacy of the Academy, Plato lived on. His journey was over, but his story was just beginning. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Plato. Plato's life had come to an end, but his journey was far from over. His body may have passed, but his ideas, his teachings, his philosophy, they lived on, spreading like ripples in a pond, touching the minds and hearts of people all over the world. Plato's legacy was not just in the books he wrote or the students he taught. It was in the way he changed the way people thought about the world. He had asked questions that no one had asked before. Questions about justice, truth, and the meaning of life. And in doing so, he opened the door to new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing the world. One of the most important parts of Plato's legacy was his idea of the world of forms. This idea that everything in the physical world is just a shadow of a perfect, eternal form changed the way people understood reality. It made them think deeply about what is real, what is true, and what is merely an illusion. This idea influenced not just philosophers, but also artists, scientists, and religious thinkers for centuries to come. Plato's vision of the philosopher king also left a lasting mark on history. His belief that rulers should be wise, just, and guided by truth inspired leaders across the ages. Kings, queens, and presidents read Plato's works, hoping to learn from his wisdom and apply it to their own rule. The idea that those who govern should be guided by wisdom rather than power or wealth remains a powerful ideal in many parts of the world today. The academy, the school that Plato founded, continued to thrive long after his death. It became a center of learning, a place where students from all over the Greek world came to study philosophy, science, and mathematics. The academy was more than just a school. It was a community of thinkers, a place where ideas were born and debated, where the pursuit of knowledge was valued above all else. For nearly 1,000 years, the academy influenced the course of Western thought. The ideas that were discussed and developed there laid the foundation for many of the philosophies and sciences that we know today. Even after the academy itself was closed, its spirit lived on in the universities and schools that followed. But Plato's influence was not limited to the ancient world. His works were preserved and studied throughout the Middle Ages, particularly in the Islamic world, where scholars translated his writings into Arabic and used them to develop their own philosophical traditions. In Europe, during the Renaissance, Plato's ideas experienced a revival. Thinkers, artists, and scientists rediscovered his works, finding inspiration in his vision of a world guided by reason and wisdom. Plato's dialogues, with their rich characters and engaging conversations, became a model for how to explore complex ideas in a way that was both accessible and profound. They were not just philosophical texts, but works of literature, full of drama, emotion, and depth. Readers throughout history have been captivated by the dialogues, finding in them both intellectual challenge and moral guidance. Plato's influence can also be seen in the development of Christianity. Early Christian thinkers, like Augustine, were deeply influenced by Plato's ideas, particularly his concept of the world of forms and the immortality of the soul. They used Plato's philosophy to help explain and defend their own beliefs, blending his ideas with their religious teachings. In this way, Plato's thoughts became a part of the foundation of Western religion and spirituality. As the centuries passed, Plato's works continued to be studied, debated, and reinterpreted. His ideas influenced the Enlightenment thinkers who valued reason and wisdom as the highest human virtues. They saw in Plato a kindred spirit, someone who believed in the power of the human mind to understand the world and improve society. In modern times, Plato's legacy lives on in the fields of philosophy, science, politics, and education. His questions about the nature of reality, the pursuit of justice, and the role of knowledge in society are still relevant today. Philosophers continue to study his works, finding new meanings and insights in his writings. Scientists, too, are inspired by Plato's belief that the world is governed by underlying principles and patterns, seeking to uncover the truths that lie beneath the surface. Plato's influence is also felt in the world of education. His belief in the importance of educating the whole person, mind, body, and soul, has shaped the way we think about learning and teaching. The idea that education should be about more than just acquiring knowledge, that it should also be about developing character and wisdom, is a central principle in many educational systems today. But perhaps the most enduring part of Plato's legacy is his commitment to the pursuit of truth. Throughout his life, Plato never stopped asking questions, never stopped seeking, never stopped trying to understand the world and our place in it. He believed that the search for truth was the highest goal of human life, and he devoted himself to that search with passion and dedication. This commitment to truth, to wisdom, to the good, is what has made Plato's legacy so powerful and lasting. His ideas have inspired countless generations to think deeply, to question, to explore. They have challenged us to look beyond the surface, to seek the deeper truths that lie hidden in the world around us. As we look back on Plato's life and work, we see a man who was not content to accept the world as it was, who dreamed of what it could be. We see a philosopher who was not afraid to challenge the status quo, who dared to ask the big questions. We see a teacher who believed in the power of ideas, who devoted his life to sharing those ideas with others. Plato's journey may have ended, but his influence on the world is eternal. His ideas continue to shape the way we think, the way we live, the way we understand ourselves and our world. He has left us with a legacy of wisdom, a treasure of thought, a guide to the life of the mind. And as long as there are people who seek truth, who value wisdom, who believe in the power of ideas, Plato's legacy will live on. In the quiet of the academy, in the pages of his dialogues, in the minds of all who study his works, Plato's voice still speaks. It whispers to us of justice, of truth, of the good life. It invites us to join him on the journey of the mind, a journey that began in ancient Athens, but that continues today and will continue for as long as there are minds to think, hearts to feel, and souls to seek. And so, Plato's story is not just the story of one man. It is the story of all of us, of our shared quest for understanding, for wisdom, for truth. His journey is our journey, and his legacy, a gift to the world, one that will endure for all time.